The picked feeds died 3 solar hours before the first spire collapsed. But the stench of ozone and copper had already settled into the marrow of my bones. I am a logister of the 3rd rank, a man of ledgers and vox tapes. Yet no archive prepares a soul for the sound of 10 billion voices screaming in a key that does not exist in the imperial hymnal. The ventilation systems began pumping the smell of rotting lilies and scorched hair through the hab-blocks, a biological signature of the warp's touch that bypassed every filter the Mechanicus had installed. We watched the lower level monitors as the sanitation workers stopped scrubbing the walls and began using their own fingernails to carve geometries into the plasteel. By the time the enforcers realized the rebellion wasn't over bread or tithers, the metal itself was weeping a fluid that burned like acid and hummed like a choir. If you still walk beside me through fire and scripture, then bear witness. Subscribe, share this burden, and let others hear the truth buried beneath hymns. The descent into damnation did not begin with a roar of cannons or the thunder of drop pods hitting the crust of the planet. It began with a subtle, rhythmic clicking in the cogitators of the sub-sector census office. I spent my 40th year in the service of the Golden Throne, tracking the caloric intake of the mid-Hive hab-blocks, a task as mundane as it was vital to the continued stability of our iron hive. We were a world of gears and grease, a cog in the greater machine of the segmentum, yet I noticed the deviation in the meat vats long before the first cultist drew a blade. The nutrient slurry was being diverted, small percentages at first, redirected by ghost codes and logic loops that bypassed the primary logic engines. When I petitioned my superior, a man whose skin had become more parchment than flesh from a century of sitting beneath the hum of the cooling vents, he told me that the machine's spirits were restless due to a solar flare. He did not look at me when he said it. He looked at the shadows dancing behind the iron pillars of our scriptorium, his eyes darting as if he expected the darkness to leap forward and swallow his tongue. I remember the taste of the air that day, a heavy, metallic tang that coated the back of my throat, smelling of old pennies and the stagnant water that collects in the bottom of a ship's hull. The vox casters in the hallways, which usually barked out production quotas and prayers of the ecclesiarchy, began to stutter, emitting a low-frequency thrum that made the fluid in my inner ear vibrate with a sickening pulse. It was a sound that didn't just reach the ears. It reached the bone, a vibration that felt like teeth grinding against a chalkboard deep inside my skull. By the time the second week of the shift cycle arrived, the silence in the upper spires had become deafening. We received no new directives from the governor's court, and the astropathic choir's daily broadcast was replaced by a static hiss that sounded like millions of insects scuttling over dry leaves. I ventured down to the primary logic vaults to investigate the caloric diversion in person. Stepping out of the pressurized elevators into a world that had begun to soften at the edges, the walls of the manufactorum, once rigid and reinforced with layers of lead and plastisteel, seemed to bulge and ripple in the dim light of the flickering amber lumens. I saw a technician, a man I had known for a decade, standing before an open cooling vent. He was not repairing it, he was whispering to it, his voice a rhythmic drone that matched the clicking of the failing machinery. When I called his name, he turned, and I saw that he had stitched his eyelids open with copper wire, his pupils dilated until the white of his eyes was gone entirely. He told me that the Great Father was breathing through the pipes now, and that the air we had been consuming for 10,000 years was nothing but a slow poison. He laughed, a wet, rattling sound that ended in a spray of black bile, and I realized then that the corruption was not an external force pressing against our gates, but a cancer that had already woven itself into the very infrastructure of our lives. The smell of the lilies returned, stronger now, masking the scent of the promethium and the sweat of the teeming billions. It was the scent of a funeral parlor, sweet and cloying, designed to hide the rot beneath the surface. I fled back to my station, my boots clattering on the metal grates, the sound echoing through corridors that felt longer and narrower than they had been only hours before. I passed a group of enforcers who were stripping off their armor, their movements slow and deliberate like those of a man entering a bath. They were painting their chest plates with a dark, viscous fluid, their faces devoid of any emotion other than a terrifying, vacant peace. One of them held a shock maul that had been modified with jagged shards of industrial glass, the weapon humming with a localized warp charge that made the air around it shimmer with heat. They did not stop me. They did not even acknowledge my presence, for I was still a creature of the old world, a ghost haunting a machine that had already been claimed by a new master. The pressure in my head was becoming a physical weight, a localized gravity that pulled my thoughts toward the darker corners of my own mind. I began to remember things I had never experienced. The sensation of drowning in a sea of blood, the sound of 1,000 drums beating in the void, the feeling of 1,000,000 invisible fingers trailing across my skin. I locked myself in the Logister's sanctuary, a small room lined with lead and warded with the purity seals of the Adeptus Ministorum. But even there, the seals were beginning to curl and blacken at the edges. The wax was melting not from heat, but from the sheer presence of the unreality that was bleeding through the walls. Outside the sanctuary, the Hive city was beginning to tear itself apart. The localized Vox network erupted with a cacophony of screams, not of pain, but of a hideous, ecstatic release. The workers in the chemical pits had opened the main valves, flooding the lower levels with hallucinogenic gases that turned the darkness into a canvas for their new gods. I watched on a small, flickering monitor as a crowd of thousands threw themselves into the massive grinding gears of the primary ore processor, their bodies clogging the machinery until the great iron teeth broke and shattered. They were not trying to sabotage the works. They were offering themselves as grease for a different kind of engine. The blood of the billions was being channeled into the drainage systems, redirected by the same ghost, codes I had discovered earlier, flowing toward a central point deep in the Hive's geothermal core. The geometry of the city was being rewritten in red, a giant, three-dimensional sigil being traced in the dark with the life force of the Emperor's subjects. I sat in the dark, clutching my prayer beads until the wood bit into my palms, listening to the sound of the Hive's heart stopping, and then, slowly, beginning to beat again with a new, irregular rhythm. It was a heavy, wet thud that shook the floor tiles, a sound that signaled the end of the city's life as a vessel of the Imperium and its rebirth as a womb for the warp. As the hours bled into one another, the very physics of the room began to fail. My shadow, cast by the single remaining lumen, grew long and independent, moving even when I remained still. It reached out toward the walls, stroking the metal as if it were skin. The temperature plummeted, yet I was sweating, a cold, oily perspiration that smelled of sulfur. I realized that the diversion of calories, the whispering in the vents, and the stitching of eyes were merely the prologue. The Hive was no longer a collection of buildings and people. It was becoming a singular organism, a massive, unthinking beast that was trying to wake up. I could feel the thoughts of the billions pressing against my mind, a tide of collective insanity that threatened to wash away my identity. I saw visions of the governor, his golden throne replaced by a pile of charred bones, his skin being peeled away by invisible hands to reveal the shifting, multi-hued scales beneath. He was still screaming, his voice amplified by the palace's Vox array, a broadcast of pure agony that was being piped into every hab-block and every work station. The screams were the fuel, the blood was the lubricant, and our collective terror was the spark that would ignite the final transformation. I reached for my data, slate to record these final moments, but the screen was no longer displaying numbers. It was showing a single, unblinking eye that followed my every movement, its pupil a swirling galaxy of purple and gold. I was no longer a Logister. I was a witness to the birth of a nightmare. A chronicler of the moment the light of the Astronomicon was snuffed out by the rising tide of the great enemy. The transition from systemic malfunction to overt blasphemy occurred during the third watch of the long night, when the atmospheric scrubbers stopped removing the toxins and began synthesizing something far worse. I remained huddled in my sanctuary, the lead-lined walls providing a fragile illusion of safety, while the macro structure of Hive Primus groaned like a dying titan. The silence of the logic engines was replaced by a sound that I can only describe as the Hive City trying to breathe through a throat filled with blood. It was a rhythmic, wet heaving that pulsated through the floor plates, vibrating my teeth until the enamel felt ready to shatter. I checked the secondary monitors, those hard-wired into the emergency lumens, and saw that the corridors of the Logis division had been transformed into a charnel house of sensory excess. The walls were no longer cold, grey plasteel. They had taken on a bruised, purple hue, and the rivets were weeping a thick, translucent echo that smelled of overripe fruit and copper. The shadows in the corners were no longer absences of light, but physical entities that coiled and uncoiled with a serpentine grace, occasionally lashing out to snatch a stray parchment or a discarded tool. I watched a servitor, its lobotomized brain unable to process the shifting reality, continue its programmed patrol until the floor beneath its tracked units softened into a gelatinous mire. The machine sank inch by inch, its metal chassis screaming as the warp, tainted matter began to digest it, turning iron into flesh and oil into bile. The first incursions of the physical warp manifested not as monsters, but as a total collapse of the laws of geometry and proportion within our living quarters. I witnessed, through the grain of a flickering Pict, feed a group of refugees from the lower hab-blocks attempting to flee upward, their faces masks of soot and terror. As they ran through the main transit artery of Sector 7G, the corridor began to elongate, the far end receding into an impossible distance, while the floor slanted at an angle that defied gravity. They were running on a flat surface, yet their bodies were tilted 45 degrees, their feet slipping on a carpet of growing, iridescent moss that sprouted from the metal in seconds. One by one, they were claimed by the architecture itself. A woman tripped, and as she hit the floor, the metal rose up to meet her like a hungry mouth. Her screams cut short as she was integrated into the structural support of the hallway. Her face remained visible in the wall, a frozen mask of agony that the other refugees used as a handhold as they scrambled past. There was no malice in the metal, only a senseless, shifting hunger to redefine what was solid and what was soul. I turned away from the screen, my stomach heaving, and found that my own desk had begun to grow hair, long, coarse strands of black mane that sprouted from the data ports, smelling of a stable fire. The Hive's communication array, once the pride of our sector, became a conduit for the psychic screams of the dying astropaths. Their collective agony was being broadcast on every frequency, a psychic shockwave that shattered the glass in the observation domes and caused the skulls of the weak-willed to burst. I covered my ears, but the sound was inside my mind, a choir of 10,000 voices singing the praises of a prince whose name tasted like ash. I saw the air in my sanctuary begin to shimmer with a heat haze, though the thermometer showed the room was freezing. Tiny, winged creatures, no larger than a man's thumb and looking like a cross between a moth and a severed finger, began to manifest from the static of the monitors. They fluttered about the room, their wings beating with a sound like whispering secrets, leaving trails of glowing dust that burned holes in my robes. I realized then that the veil had not just been thinned, it had been shredded, and the Hive City was now a gaping wound in the side of reality. The pressure in my chest was unbearable, as if my heart were being squeezed by a giant, invisible hand that pulsed in time with the Hive's new, sickening heartbeat. I reached for my flask of consecrated water, but as I uncorked it, the liquid turned into a swarm of black flies that exploded into my face. their tiny bodies crawling into my mouth and nostrils before dissolving into a bitter, oily mist. Down in the great manufactorum, the work crews who had not yet been integrated into the walls had formed themselves into grand, interlocking circles. They were no longer individuals, they were a singular, undulating mass of flesh moving in a choreographed frenzy of self-mutilation. I watched on the long-range scanners as they used industrial torches to cauterize symbols into each other's backs, the smoke rising in thick, greasy plumes that formed the shapes of dancing figures in the rafters. The overseers, those men who had once been the iron fist of imperial law, stood at the center of these circles, their eyes rolled back in their heads, their mouths hanging open as they channeled the raw energy of the warp. They were shouting commands in a language that sounded like glass breaking, and with every syllable, the heavy machinery of the hive began to change. Lathers and presses twisted into serrated claws, cooling pipes coiled like intestines, and the massive furnaces began to roar with a fire that was a deep, bruised violet. They were forging weapons, but not for the defense of the hive. They were crafting jagged blades and spiked armor that seemed to pulse with a life of its mechanized own, preparing for the moment the gates of the palace would be thrown wide. The scale of the betrayal was monumental, a logistical masterpiece of corruption that had taken decades to perfect under our very noses. I looked back through my archived files, my fingers trembling as I scrolled through years of requisition orders. I saw the patterns now, the excess shipments of psychotropic chemicals disguised as medical supplies, the subtle alterations in the hive's defensive grid that created blind spots in the inner sanctum, the systematic replacement of loyal priests with men whose faith was a hollow shell. We had built our own gallows, and we had done it with the efficiency and zeal that the Imperium demands of its servants. Every prayer we had chanted in the dark, every hour of back-breaking labor we had endured, had been redirected to feed this coming storm. The realization was a physical blow, a cold weight in my gut that made me want to lay down and let the growing hair on my desk consume me. But the Vox unit on the wall suddenly crackled to life, and for the first time in hours, it wasn't a scream or a chant. It was a voice, cold, rhythmic, and terrifyingly calm. It was the governor, speaking from his bunker, but his voice was layered with 1,000 other echoes. He was announcing the commencement of the great unfleshing, inviting us all to shed the burden of our humanity and join the feast that had been prepared in the dark. As he spoke, the lights in my sanctuary finally failed, leaving me in a darkness so thick it felt like liquid. I could hear the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the ceiling above me, a wet, slithering noise accompanied by the clicking of many multi-jointed legs. The lead lining of my room, meant to protect against radiation and psychic intrusion, was being peeled back like the skin of a fruit. I could feel the cold air of the hive rushing in, carrying with it the scent of 1 billion rotting lilies and the distant sound of a grand, discordant symphony. I realized that my sanctuary was no longer a cage, it was an altar. The walls began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent light, revealing that the prayers I had scrawled on the parchment were being rewritten by an invisible hand, the Gothic script twisting into jagged, hateful runes. I fell to my knees, not to pray to the Emperor, for his light felt 1,000,000 light years away, but because my legs would no longer support the weight of my own soul. The floor beneath me began to thrum with a localized heat, and I saw a crack open in the plasteel, a glowing vein of molten warp, stuff that looked like a river of liquid gold and violet fire. I watched, mesmerized, as the first claw, long, elegant, and tipped with a diamond-hard talon, emerged from the rift and hooked itself onto the edge of my desk. The creature that followed was a nightmare of aesthetic perfection and horrific intent. It rose from the floor with a fluid, terrifying grace, its body a leather tapestry of pale skin and shimmering silk. It had too many limbs, and its face was a mask of porcelain beauty split by a vertical mouth filled with needle teeth. It did not attack me. It simply stood there, breathing in the scent of my terror as if it were the finest perfume. It spoke, not with words, but with a series of harmonic vibrations that resonated in my very cells, telling me of the delights that awaited those who embraced the change. It showed me a vision of the hive as it would soon be, a spire of living flesh reaching toward a sky that was a permanent whirlpool of color, a monument to the ecstasy of the fall. I saw the billions of citizens transformed into a singular, screaming tapestry of pleasure and pain, their individual lives discarded like old clothes. The creature reached out a hand, its fingers stroking the air inches from my face, and I felt a jolt of pleasure so intense it was indistinguishable from agony. I knew then that the hive was gone. There would be no liberation, no heroic stand by the Astartes that could undo what had been sown into the soil of this world. We were the harvest, and the reapers had finally arrived with their silver sickles. I tried to find my sidearm, a stub, pistol I kept for emergencies, but the metal had turned into a soft, doughy substance that crumbled in my hand. Everything that was once solid, once dependable, was being reclaimed by the primordial chaos. I looked out the small, reinforced viewport of my sanctuary and saw the upper spires of the hive beginning to melt, the great Gothic arches drooping like wax in a flame. The sky above was no longer black, it was a churning sea of pinks, purples and deep, bruised blues, with flashes of green lightning that illuminated the clouds of drifting ash. I saw the first of the silver chariots descending from the clouds, graceful vessels that looked more like organic sculptures than machines of war. They were followed by swarms of smaller flyers that darted through the air like schools of predatory fish. The defense lasers of the hive fired once, a futile beam of red light that was swallowed by the shifting colors of the sky, and then they were silent. The silence was the worst part. The transition from the frantic screams of the dying to the eerie, rhythmic chanting of the transformed. The hive was no longer dying, it was being reborn into a state of perpetual, agonizing bliss. I sat back against the weeping wall, watching the creature in my room as it began to dance, a slow, hypnotic movement that seemed to pull the very air out of my lungs. I realized that I was recording this not for any future historian, for there would be no future for this world, but as a final act of defiance against the sensory tide. I am a logister. I count, I record, I categorize. Even as my mind begins to fray at the edges, even as the scent of the lilies becomes the only thing I can smell, I will describe the shape of our end. The creature leaned in close, its vertical mouth opening to reveal a tongue that was a flickering ribbon of fire. It whispered a single word into my ear, a name that I cannot write, a name that caused the last of my purity seals to burst into white flame. I felt my skin begin to itch, 1,000 tiny movements beneath the surface as my own biology began to rebel against its form. The transformation was beginning. My fingers, as they move across this slate, are growing longer, the joints multiplying, the nails hardening into obsidian points. I am becoming a part of the tapestry. I am becoming a note in the grand, discordant symphony of the hive's new master. The sensory overload of the great unfleshing reached its zenith when the gravity generators of the hive's mid-levels finally inverted, turning the world into a spinning gyre of debris and viscera. I was no longer a man sitting in a room. I was a passenger on a sinking ship of reality, watching as the iron foundations of my existence were bartered away for a moment of forbidden enlightenment. The creature that had invaded my sanctuary was not alone anymore. Through the rent in the lead-lined wall, I could see shadows of things that were once human, or perhaps once machines, or perhaps never anything at all, dancing in the corridors. They moved with a synchronization that was telepathic, their limbs elongated into scythes, their skin replaced by a shimmering, translucent membrane that pulsed with the light of the warp. I felt the logic of my mind, the carefully constructed walls of imperial dogma and mathematical certainty, crumbling into dust. In its place was a burgeoning awareness of the warp's true nature. It was not a place, but a state of being. A chaotic ocean that had finally breached the levees of our physical world. The air grew thick and heavy, like liquid gold. And every breath I drew felt as though I was swallowing a handful of needles and honey. I crawled toward the window, my new, multi-jointed fingers clicking against the floor like the legs of a crab. Outside, the hive had become a vertical forest of bone and neon. The great spires, once monuments to the Emperor's unyielding will, were now curved and organic, resembling the ribs of some impossible celestial beast. The sky had been completely replaced by a swirling vortex of emerald and magenta, a storm of psychic energy that rained down liquid light instead of water. I saw a squadron of Valkyrie gunships, their pilots driven mad by the discord, flying in frantic, looping patterns before intentionally slamming into the side of a manufactorum. They did not explode, they were absorbed, the metal of the ships merging with the stone of the building to create a new, hybrid structure that breathed black smoke through jagged, tooth-like vents. The scale of the transformation was so vast that it surpassed horror and entered the realm of the divine. It was a masterpiece of desecration, a perfect inversion of everything the Imperium had stood for. Every prayer for order had been answered with a tidal wave of chaos, and every hope for salvation had been replaced by the absolute certainty of the fall. The screams that had defined the earlier hours had shifted in tone. They were no longer the sounds of people resisting death. They were the sounds of people discovering that death was no longer an escape. In the warp's embrace, the soul is not permitted to flee. I watched as a group of citizens in the plaza below were systematically unmade and remade. Their bodies were stretched and woven together to form a living carpet for the arrival of the higher entities. I could see their eyes, billions of eyes, blinking in unison from the floor of the plaza, staring up at the shifting sky with a mixture of terror and a terrible, blooming ecstasy. They were part of a larger consciousness now, their individual identities dissolved into a collective pool of sensation. I realized then that the caloric diversion I had discovered weeks ago had been a preparation for this. It was a way of ensuring that the population had just enough energy to survive the initial shock of the transformation, to be conscious participants in their own damnation. We were not being killed, we were being harvested for our ability to feel, to suffer, and to witness the glory of the coming prince. A sudden, violent vibration shook the spire, followed by a sound like a cathedral bell being struck by a comet. The primary geothermal core, the heart of the hive, had finally been breached by the warp stuff. On my dying monitor, I saw the thermal readings spike into the millions of degrees. Yet the coolant pipes were not melting, they were turning into crystal. The energy being released was not heat, but pure, unadulterated potential. This was the fuel for the great unfleshing, the power required to tear a permanent hole in the fabric of the materium. I felt a surge of energy pulse through my own body, a localized heat that started in my spine and radiated outward until my skin felt as though it were being peeled back by an invisible flame. My vision fractured, the single image of my sanctuary breaking into 1,000 different facets, each showing a different version of the same nightmare. In one, I was a prince of the new world, draped in the silks of the damned. In another, I was a mindless beast, prowling the ruins for the scent of uncorrupted flesh. All of these possibilities existed simultaneously, and the weight of choosing between them was a burden that threatened to snap my sanity. I heard the sound of footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and rhythmic, coming from the hallway. This was not the skittering of the smaller warp entities or the frantic running of the survivors. It was the tread of something that possessed a terrifying, cold authority. The door to my sanctuary, warped and weeping as it was kicked open with a force that sent shards of metal flying across the room. Standing in the doorway was an Astartes, but he was not wearing the colors of any chapter I recognized. His power armor was a deep, bruised violet, trimmed in gold that seemed to flow like liquid. The surface of the plate was covered in etched runes that glowed with a sickly, internal light, and his helmet had been replaced by a snarling, animalistic mask that breathed out a cloud of narcotic incense. He held a massive chainsword that hummed with a voice of its own, the teeth of the blade made from the fangs of some prehistoric predator. He looked at me, his eyes two burning embers of amber fire, and I felt my soul shrink beneath his gaze. He did not speak, but I could hear his thoughts, a low, frequency roar of pride, desire, and a total, absolute rejection of the Emperor's law. He was a champion of the fall, a veteran of 1,000 wars against the light, and he had come to claim the fruits of the harvest. He stepped into the room, and the air seemed to bow before him. The creature that had been dancing in the corner hissed, and retreated into the shadows, acknowledging a superior predator. The Astartes walked over to my desk, his gauntlet brushing against the parchment and data, slates I had spent my life tending. As he touched them, the documents burst into a black, oily flame that left no ash. He was an agent of entropy, a living catalyst for the end of things. He reached out and grabbed me by the front of my robes, lifting me off the floor with a strength that was effortless and terrifying. I looked into the depths of his mask, and for a second, the amber fire cleared, and I saw a human eye, cold, ancient, and filled with a joy so profound it made me want to weep. He whispered a single phrase in a language that bypassed my ears and went straight to my brain. "The song is beginning." Then, he threw me through the rent in the wall, out into the open air of the Hive's interior. I did not fall. The gravity of the sector had been so distorted that I simply drifted, suspended in a sea of thick, perfumed gas and floating debris. I drifted past the open windows of hab-blocks where families were engaged in acts of ritualized madness, their laughter echoing through the canyons of the Hive. I saw the great manufactorum from above, and it had been transformed into a massive, three-dimensional sigil of flesh and iron. The furnaces were pouring out rivers of molten gold that flowed upward into the sky, forming a bridge for the entities that were descending from the vortex. I saw the ships I had noticed earlier, the silver chariots, landing on the rooftops, their holds opening to release swarms of lithe, beautiful warriors who moved with the grace of dancers. They were the architects of this new reality, the gardeners who had come to prune the garden of its unwanted humanity. They did not use guns. They used whips, blades, and their own voices to conduct the symphony of the end. As I floated, I felt the last of my human memories beginning to dissolve. I forgot the name of the Emperor. I forgot the face of my mother. I forgot the sound of the wind on the surface of the planet before the Hive was built. All that remained was the sensation of the present, the smell of the lilies, the taste of the copper, and the sight of the beautiful, terrible fire that was consuming the world. I saw the governor's palace in the distance, the gold leaf of its domes peeling away like dead skin to reveal a structure made of polished obsidian and bone. The governor himself was standing on the highest balcony, his arms outstretched, his body glowing with a brilliance that rivaled the stars. He was the conductor of this madness, the man who had sold 1 billion lives for a seat at the right hand of a god. He was screaming, and with every scream, a new wave of warp energy washed over the city, further warping the forms of the survivors and deepening the colors of the sky. The distortion of time became absolute. Minutes felt like centuries, and decades passed in the blink of an eye. I watched as the Hive city aged 1,000 years in a single afternoon. The metal rusted and crumbled, only to be replaced by growing bone and calcified flesh. The people, the billions of souls who had once called this place home, had become part of the geological strata of the Hive. They were the bricks and the mortar, the pipes and the wiring. Their consciousness was the background hum that powered the city's new life. I saw a child, no more than 5 years old, whose body had been fused with a vox caster. He was singing a melody of such heartbreaking beauty that it caused the nearby buildings to weep. He was no longer a child, he was an instrument, a permanent part of the landscape, destined to sing until the end of time. The horror of it was balanced by an undeniable, aesthetic perfection. Everything was in its place. Everything was serving its purpose. I drifted toward the geothermal core, the glowing heart of the hive. The heat was immense now, a spiritual furnace that burned away the last of my doubts. I saw the rift at the center of the core, a jagged tear in the fabric of space that led directly into the heart of the warp. It was a window into another world, a place where the laws of physics were merely suggestions, and where the will of the powerful was the only reality. I saw the entities waiting on the other side, beings of light and shadow, of pleasure and pain, who were waiting for the gateway to be fully opened. They were the true owners of this world, the beings we had spent 10,000 years trying to keep at bay. And now, thanks to the diversion of calories, the stitching of eyes, and the whispers in the vents, the door was finally open. I felt a pull from the rift, a magnetic attraction that was both physical and spiritual. I was being drawn into the heart of the storm. Toward the moment of my final transformation, the Astartes appeared beside me again, floating in the void, as if he were standing on solid ground. He looked at the rift, and then he looked at me. He raised his chainsword, the teeth of the blade beginning to spin with a sound like 1,000 cicadas. He didn't strike me. Instead, he used the tip of the blade to draw a symbol on my chest, the heat of the weapon cauterizing the skin and leaving a permanent mark of ownership. I didn't feel pain. I felt a sense of completion, as if I had finally found the piece of myself that had been missing all along. He pointed toward the rift and spoke again, his voice a thunderous command that shook the very foundations of my soul. Behold the beginning. With a final, violent surge of energy, the core exploded not outward, but inward, pulling the entire hive city, every spire, every citizen, and every memory, into the waiting arms of the warp. We were no longer part of the Imperium. We were no longer part of the universe of man. We were home. The moment of passage through the geothermal rift felt like being flayed by a gale of silk and glass. There was no longer an up or a down, only an all-consuming in, between where the screams of Hive Primus were stretched into a single, eternal chord of discordant music. I watched, with eyes that were now multifaceted and weeping a pearlescent fluid, as the physical structures of my world dissolved into their constituent concepts. The massive iron support pillars of the lower levels did not merely break, they turned into columns of solidified regret, crumbling into a fine, grey powder that tasted of forgotten promises. The millions of tons of plasteel and rockcrete that had once housed 10 billion souls were now nothing more than thoughts drifting in a psychic gale. I could see the souls of the citizens, tiny, flickering sparks of white light, being chased by predatory shadows that looked like ribbons of wet velvet. The air was thick with the scent of the lilies, but it was joined now by the smell of ozone, old blood, and a sweetness so intense it caused the back of my throat to blister. I was no longer drifting, I was being woven into the fabric of a new reality, my limbs extending into the void like the roots of a tree seeking water in a desert of fire. The Astartes who had marked me was still there, a titan of violet and gold standing upon the wreckage of a floating cathedral dome. He was laughing, a sound that bypassed my hearing and vibrated directly in my marrow, a deep, rhythmic booming that seemed to steady the chaos around him. He raised his chainsword toward the swirling vortex above, and I saw that the blade was no longer made of metal. It was a sliver of concentrated spite, a jagged tooth of the warp that drank the light of the nearby soul sparks. Around him, the silver chariots I had seen earlier were beginning to dock with the drifting remains of the hive's upper spires. These vessels were not made of bolts and plates, but were grown from the same psychotropic crystal that now lined the geothermal core. They pulsated with a bioluminescent rhythm, matching the heartbeat of the hive. From their hatches emerged the masters of this carnival, entities of such horrific beauty that to look upon them was to feel one's own sanity being grated away like skin against a rasp. They were tall, impossibly thin, and draped in silks that shifted colors based on the intensity of the nearby suffering. They moved through the vacuum of the rift as if it were a ballroom, their feet never touching the debris. Their movements a choreographed insult to the laws of inertia. I found myself pulled toward one of these entities, my body twitching with a newfound sensory hunger that I could not control. My fingers, now long and obsidian-tipped, reached out to touch the hem of its garment, and as I did, I was flooded with the memories of the Hive's final moments from a billion different perspectives. I felt the heat of the mother in the Hive who held her child as they both turned into glass. I tasted the salt of the enforcer's tears as he turned his weapon on his own squad. I heard the final, clicking prayer of the tech priest who realized his machine, God, had been a mask for something much older and hungrier. This was the tithe. This was the purpose of the harvest. We were not just being consumed, we were being indexed. Every sensation we had ever felt was being distilled into a fine, psychic liquor for these entities to savor. I realized that the Imperium's greatest failure was not its cruelty or its stagnation, but its insistence on the dullness of the soul. The warp did not want our obedience, it wanted our intensity. It wanted the raw, unrefined power of our passions, and in the death of our Hive, it had found a vintage of unparalleled quality. The Hive city was now a sprawling, floating archipelago of madness, drifting through a sky that had no sun, only a pulsing, purple eye that took up the entire horizon. The eye did not blink, it watched with a cold, appreciative curiosity as we tore ourselves apart for its amusement. I saw the governor's palace again, but it had undergone its final transformation. It was no longer a building, it was a throne of bone and light, perched atop a mountain of screaming faces. The governor sat there, his body now 10 feet tall and covered in a fine, golden fur that shifted like wheat in a breeze. He held a scepter made from the spine of a saint, and with every wave of the staff, another sector of the Hive was plunged into a new form of torment. He was no longer the man I had served, he was a conduit, a hollowed-out vessel for the prince of this realm, and his voice was the sound of 1,000 lutes, being played by hands made of fire. He called to us, a siren song that promised an eternity of this. No more hunger, no more toil, only the endless, escalating peak of the fall. As the ships of the damned began to tow the remains of our world deeper into the eye, I saw the first signs of the warp's true ecology. Huge, translucent beasts, shaped like jellyfish but the size of continent clusters, drifted through the psychic ether, their tentacles reaching down to scoop up the stray thoughts and fragments of souls that had escaped the initial harvest. They were the scavengers of the void, and they sang a low, booming melody that sounded like the grinding of tectonic plates. One of these tentacles brushed against the remains of the logic vault where I had spent my life. I watched as the lead-lined walls, the purity seals, and the ancient cogitators were dissolved in an instant, turned into a cloud of iridescent vapor that the beast inhaled with a shudder of pleasure. My past, the very records of my existence, were nothing more than a light snack for a creature that did not know the meaning of the word man. The insignificance of our struggle hit me then, a cold, hollow realization that was more painful than any physical mutation. We were not even the main course. We were the garnish on a plate that had been prepared before the first star was born. The Astartes stepped off his floating perch and drifted toward me, his violet armor now encrusted with the salt of evaporated souls. He placed a heavy gauntlet on my shoulder, and for the first time, he spoke with a voice that I could hear with my own ears. It was a wet, grinding sound like stones being turned in a stream of oil. "You are the scribe," he said, and the words felt like a brand being applied to my mind. "You will record the glory of the prince's arrival. You will be the memory of this place when the flesh has all been spent." He handed me a new tool, a stylus made from a splinter of the rift gate and a scroll of skin that was still warm to the touch. The skin was my own. Flayed from my back in a moment I did not remember, yet I felt no pain, only a sense of profound duty. I was being given the highest honor a slave can receive, the right to witness the master's triumph. I began to write, the stylus carving runes into the parchment that glowed with a sickly, internal light. I wrote of the beauty of the corruption, of the grace of the slaughter, and of the absolute, terrifying freedom of the fall. The deeper we traveled into the eye, the more the hive began to lose its physical cohesion. The floating islands of rubble started to merge with the jellyfish, beasts, forming a hybrid ecosystem where the metal of the vents acted as skeletal structures for the warp creatures. I saw a manufactorum chimney that was now a giant, pulsing throat, breathing out clouds of spores that caused any surviving humans to sprout feathers and scales. The survivors were no longer trying to hide. They were dancing in the streets of their ruined city, their bodies contorted into shapes that should have been fatal, their laughter a constant, high-pitched ringing that never ceased. They had found their place in the new order. They were the livestock of the warp, and they were happy in their servitude. They had been freed from the burden of choice, from the fear of death, and from the crushing weight of the Emperor's expectations. In the eye of the prince, they were perfect. I looked back one last time at the rift we had come through, but it was closing, the jagged tear in reality being stitched shut by the same invisible hands that had opened it. The materium was gone. The Imperium, with its cold iron and its silent god, was a distant memory, a nightmare from which we had finally woken up. The Astartes was right. The song was beginning, and I was the one who would write the lyrics. I felt a surge of creative energy, a fire in my veins that demanded to be expressed. I began to carve the story of our descent into the living parchment, my obsidian fingers moving with a speed and precision I had never possessed as a man of the administratum. I wrote of the caloric diversion, the whispering in the vents, and the beauty of the first claw. I wrote until the ink was my own blood and the parchment was a tapestry of my own history. I was no longer a logister of the third rank. I was the chronicler of the end, the poet of the pit, the voice of the hive that had become a god's playground. The final transformation of my mind occurred when the violet eye in the sky finally spoke. It did not use words, but a single, harmonic vibration that shattered the last of my human concepts. I understood then that chaos was not the enemy of life. It was the ultimate expression of it. It was the refusal to be static, the rejection of the cage, and the embrace of the infinite possibility of the soul. The hive city was not destroyed, it was liberated from the tyranny of form. We were the pioneers of a new way of being, the first of the Emperor's children to truly grow up and leave the nursery. As I finished the first stanza of my new epic, I felt the Astartes' hand tighten on my shoulder. He was looking at the throne of the governor, where the prince was finally beginning to manifest, a being of such radiant, blinding beauty that the very air around him turned into liquid gold. The prince looked at us, and in that gaze I saw the beginning of 1,000 years of pleasure, 1,000 years of pain, and 1,000 years of the most beautiful music ever heard in the void. I laid my stylus down on the floating desk of bone and looked at my hands. They were beautiful, long, elegant, and perfectly suited for the work I was to do. I looked at the Astartes, and I saw not a monster, but a brother, a fellow traveler in the land of the free. We stood together on the edge of the world, watching as the hive city was swallowed by the heart of the warp, a grand, final offering to the god of sensation. The smell of the lilies was so strong now, it was the only thing in the universe. It was the scent of our beginning. It was the scent of our end. It was the scent of the prince's breath upon our necks. And as the darkness of the eye finally closed around us, I realized that I had never been more alive than I was in the moment I lost everything. The Logister was dead. Long live the scribe of the fall. The final consolidation of our reality into the prince's tapestry occurred when the concept of time itself was discarded like a rusted tool. I stood upon the floating obsidian terrace of the governor's new palace, looking out over a city that had become a literal ocean of sensation. The transition was complete. The Hive was no longer a location in the segmentum, but a permanent province of the Imperium. My task as the chronicler had evolved from recording events to defining the very essence of this new existence. With every stroke of my obsidian stylus upon the warm, living parchment, I anchored a new law of nature into the swirling chaos. I wrote of how the wind would now taste of the first kiss of a lover and the final breath of a martyr. I wrote of how the light would no longer illuminate the shadows, but instead reveal the hidden desires of those who walked within them. I was the architect of the aftermath, the one who gave a voice to the silent, screaming glory of our transformation. Below me, the billions who had once been cogs in the imperial machine were now the threads of a grand, undulating carpet of flesh. They were no longer distinct individuals, yet they had never felt more alive. I could sense their collective pulse, a rhythmic, driving beat that matched the thrumming of the violet eye above. They were engaged in a perpetual festival of the senses, a grand masquerade where the masks were fused to the skin and the music was played upon instruments made of bone and nerve wire. There was no hunger, for they fed upon the raw energy of the warp. There was no exhaustion, for their bodies were sustained by the ecstasy of their own suffering. I watched a group of former Factorum workers dancing in the ruins of a cathedral, their limbs moving in patterns that defied the old laws of physics, their voices rising in a harmony that caused the air to crystallize into gems of solidified sound. They were the new elite, the pioneers of a life without boundaries, and their joy was a physical heat that warmed the cooling metal of the Hive's skeleton. The prince's manifestation was no longer a distant threat, but an all-encompassing presence that permeated every atom of the atmosphere. He did not sit upon a throne so much as he was the throne and the palace and the sky itself. His laughter was the thunder that rolled across the iridescent clouds, and his sighs were the winds that scattered the ashes of our old lives. I felt his attention turn toward me, a gaze that felt like a warm needle being threaded through my heart. He did not demand worship. He demanded expression. He wanted to see his glory reflected in the words of a mortal who had survived the crossing. I began the final chapter of my epic, the ink flowing from my fingertips, as if my very blood had been converted into the substance of the warp. I wrote of the beauty of the final dissolution, the moment when the last brick of the Imperium's wall fell, and the light of the true gods poured through the breach. The Astartes, my brother in this dark enlightenment, stood beside me, his violet armor now completely transformed into a shell of living crystal that hummed with a low-frequency power. He looked out over the transformed Hive, his animalistic mask split by a wide, permanent grin. He was no longer a warrior of a forgotten war. He was a guardian of the new peace, a sentinel of the eternal feast. He spoke to me, his voice now a melodic chime that resonated in the hollows of my chest. He told me of the other worlds that were waiting for the prince's touch, the other hives that were still trapped in the cold, grey cage of the emperor's law. He spoke of the crusades we would lead, not to conquer, but to liberate, to bring the gift of the sensory tide to every corner of the galaxy. We were the seeds of a new garden, and our hive was merely the first flower to bloom in the dark. I looked down at my hands one last time, seeing the way the obsidian skin caught the light of the violet eye. I remembered the man I was, the logister who worried about caloric intake and nutrient slurry. That man was a ghost, a pale shadow of the being I had become. I realized that the corruption was not a destruction of the self, but a fulfillment of it. The Imperium had asked us to be less than we were, to be small, silent, and obedient. The prince asked us to be everything, to be loud, vibrant, and infinite. As I placed the final rune upon the scroll, I felt a sense of profound peace, a stillness that was the center of the storm. The great unfleshing was not an end, but a beginning. The Hive city of Primus was gone, replaced by a monument to the eternal now. A place where the soul could finally breathe without the suffocating weight of the iron mask. The sky above began to rain down a fine, golden dust that turned everything it touched into a shimmering, bioluminescent version of itself. I watched as the last of the rusted pipes in the distance were transformed into flutes of ivory, and the piles of rubble became mounds of fragrant petals. The transformation was total, absolute, and irreversible. We were home, and the door was locked behind us with a key made of our own desires. I rolled up the parchment of my life's work and handed it to the Astartes, who took it with a reverent bow. This was my legacy. The testimony of the man who saw the world end and realized it was the best thing that ever happened to him.